This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 851 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. We've got a mailbag episode today, but before getting into the questions, I want to remind you to check out Late Round Fantasy Football on both Instagram and YouTube. The Instagram account has videos and data nuggets posted every single day, and it's at LateRoundFF. The YouTube channel can be found at youtube.com/@LateRoundFF. This was year one of just feeling things out with those platforms, but there's going to be more in year two, so you'll want to be following before things get bigger and better. Now let's get to these questions. The first question this week is from Patreon. It's from Derek. It says, how much should we value immediate opportunity in dynasty drafts? Fantasy Calc recently tweeted value movements, and many of the players who increased in value had immediate opportunity, like JSN and Quentin Johnston versus Zay Flowers and Jordan Addison. Clearly there's hindsight bias, but with how reactionary the dynasty community can be, should we value early opportunity more? So yes and no. This is going to be a really long answer. This is going to take up a lot of today's show, but I think it's a really important thing. I think when there are obvious situations where a player isn't going to play in year one, or at least not play for a long time during year one, you should devalue that player. Jameson Williams last year is a great example of that. He was being selected in rookie drafts ahead of some really, really good wide receivers, even though we all knew that he wouldn't play for a while coming off that ACL. It's why I personally had him at the bottom of that round one wide receiver tier in my rankings. Because we want players to immediately appreciate and value. And Williams was more than likely just going to maintain at best, at least to start the year. Now, the reason I say obvious situations is because the idea of immediate opportunity, it's not very clear cut. Like, look at your question. You mentioned Quentin Johnston as someone who didn't see immediate opportunity, bucketing him with Jackson Smith and Jigba. Johnson has played most of the year without a wide receiver 2 for the Chargers. He's just been bad, so his value hasn't risen. And for the record, I'm recording this before Thursday night's game. Meanwhile, JSN has been buried behind Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf. And we all kind of knew that there was this possibility that JSN wouldn't be some stud in year one. It's why, despite being most people's favorite wide receiver from the 2023 class, he was still drafted as more of a wide receiver 4 in redraft. His projection didn't look stellar, but he did have upside if number 1, he just ended up being a really, really good player, like an amazing player, or number 2, he had injury upside. If one of 2 players got hurt, and I talked about this all season long, if either Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf got hurt, so there were 2 outs here for JSN, he would see an uptick in production. But knock on wood, DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett have stayed relatively healthy this year. What I'm really getting at here is that talent is what drives opportunity. When a player has undeniable talent, he'll at least create some sort of opportunity for himself. And it doesn't have to be some league-winning opportunity either. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that they show us something. They're able to not be labeled as busts right away. Talent drives opportunity, especially at a position like wide receiver. The examples that you're showing, I don't think it's hindsight bias per se. I think it's sort of selection bias. You mentioned Flowers and Addison as guys who appreciated in value because of that immediate opportunity. But what about someone like Jonathan Mingo? Mingo has shown us very, very little, and he's competing with a 33-year-old slot receiver. A player still needs to be talented to shine. An example like Jackson Smith and Jigba, it's honestly pretty unique. Those circumstances don't pop up very often. So focusing on that, I don't think that's the right thing to do. But I also think a lot of this is more specific for earlier round picks, because earlier round picks are generally being drafted on need. A team is getting a wide receiver in the first round, generally speaking, because they need a wide receiver. This is why the JSN example is unique. The Seahawks needed a wideout longer term, yes. They could have used help in 2023, yes. But not many expected a first-round wideout. But when teams are drafting first-round, maybe second-round wideouts for need, those players are just naturally going to have some opportunity because there's a need. and then they'll hopefully be talented enough to really shine. Where I think this discussion is more interesting is with late round picks, because a lot of times day 3 draft picks, they're being drafted as darts for depth, not to be used immediately. But when a player is drafted to an objectively thin depth chart, that's where things get interesting. Now, this is going to be a little bit hard to explain, but I'll do my best. Going back to the main point here, talent drives opportunity. But this isn't some black and white thing. There are going to be times where an objectively talented player is worse in fantasy football than an objectively less talented player, because situation and circumstance is still part of the equation. Look at Drake London. I think many of us would agree that Drake London's a baller. He's a very good wide receiver, but he's currently a low-end wide receiver 3 in PPR points per game right now. Do we really think that Adam Thielen, who's currently a high-end wide receiver 2, is so substantially better than Drake London as a player? Now, there's no shade to Adam Thielen here. I think he's still actually pretty good. He's just in an offense that's been incredibly conservative all year long, and they've peppered the slot. And Thielen himself is seeing more advantageous matchups based on scheme than London is. So talent isn't everything. It's just a big part of the equation. Thielen still has to be good to be doing what he's doing. And Drake London still has to be good to overcome all the crap that he's dealt with in Atlanta. But the point that I'm making here is that some gap in talent can still yield the opposite gap in production. Now imagine a world where you have 2 day 3 picks. One of them you think is more talented than the other. Maybe not by a lot, but he's more talented. But the less talented one has a much easier depth chart to climb in year 1. There are reasons to go after the less talented player in your rookie draft, or to at least split the difference if you're in multiple leagues. If the depth chart is easier to climb, then that day 3 pick may be able to have a chance to show off his talent profile. And as we know, we're not always right with our evaluations. So we should be open-minded to being wrong about who's good and who isn't. And that's especially true with a day 3 pick. The vast majority of day 3 players are going to be bad in fantasy football. Let me just give you an example. My model didn't love Puka Nacua. Now, for those of you who don't know, I don't only use my prospect model when I'm evaluating prospects. It's just a guide for me. In my write-up for Nacua in the late round prospect guide, I noted his really good yards per route run numbers in college. And that's not something that my model's analyzing. But I gave Nacua a subjective bump because of that. Now, on top of that, I wrote the following. This is from the guide. Nacua ended up falling to the Rams in round 5, and LA could use the wide receiver help. Cooper Kupp is the only locked-in piece in that offense, and Van Jefferson is set to be a free agent next season. In other words, Nacua had immediate opportunity, more than most day 3 picks would. Now, if you look at my rookie draft rankings, I had Nacua as the wide receiver 16 in this class. He ranked as the wide receiver 23 when looking solely at the model, solely at what you might consider talent. And he was the 20th wide receiver drafted in this year's class. So I ended up ranking him decently far ahead of where he was actually drafted. I bumped Nacua up a good bit. Part of that was because I felt the model didn't capture his production and what he did in college properly, but part of it was the immediate opportunity piece. Basically, we know that day 3 picks aren't going to be very talented usually, right? A day 1 pick, a day 2 pick, they're more talented than day 3 picks. So when that's the case, we need other things to latch onto in order for those players to have a shot at appreciating in value. Like Jamar Chase was going to dominate no matter where he went. Puka Nacua, in hindsight, he probably would have too. That was a huge miss by the NFL. But the majority of day 3 picks who aren't Jamar Chase level prospects, to get some production in year 1, it's going to be easier for them to get that production if their depth chart sucks, if they can climb it. Now, as a result of the Nacua stuff, I had him as a 3rd round pick in rookie drafts. Most other sources had him as a 4th rounder. Now, clearly it was a miss in the grand scheme because he's way better than a wide receiver 15, wide receiver 16 ranking. But in fantasy football, we just have to like a player a little bit more than the consensus. And now I've got Nacua on a lot of my dynasty teams. And I know that a lot of other late round prospect guide readers do too, because I've talked to them. And look, I know this is going to come off as some massive humble brag. There were others who liked Nacua way more than I did. And I had plenty of misses in this class. I was too low on Tank Dell, too low on Rashee Rice. I've got L's, trust me. I'm just trying to give you a firm, clear, and easy example of my process and how my process will indeed use immediate opportunity for a lot of these day 3 picks. Because we need every edge that we can get with these guys. So that's my incredibly long-winded way of saying this. Talent will always drive opportunity. Puka Nacua isn't having this rookie season simply because he went to a team that lacked depth. He ended up being an extremely, extremely talented player. Far more talented than I expected. But would Puka Nacua be doing this exact same thing in Jackson Smith and Jigba's position? Probably not to this degree. And that's okay to admit. I just think that at the end of the day, talent is what's most important, first and foremost. But with the more unknown prospects, the guys who have less of a chance to do well at the NFL level, layering in the immediate opportunity when it's obvious, that's a totally reasonable thing to do. And it's reasonable to do that with early round picks too. It's just that when you do that with earlier round picks, the stakes are higher. And we always want to lead our analysis with talent evaluation first. This next question is from @M20Workman. It says, how can someone take full advantage of a first round bye in the playoffs? It doesn't seem like a real advantage, but I want it to be one. So I'm answering this question this week because if you feel like a first round bye in fantasy football isn't a huge advantage, you got to change that way of thinking. Just think of this mathematically. In a 3-round playoff, a team getting a bye needs to just win twice. If every team had a 50-50 shot to win, that gives a first round bye team a 25% chance to win the championship. A team without a first round bye has to win 3 games in a row. At a 50% chance to win each game, that's a 12.5% chance to win it all. So right away, you have a huge advantage to win just from that. Not only that, but you can plan ahead for week 16 when others can't. You cannot roster a kicker this week, let's say, in order to stash a running back handcuff or a defense. You can look ahead and get a quarterback streamer in week 16. You can even block your opponents. I mean, think of it this way. If I told you that all of your responsibilities for work would be handled this week, but you still had to come into the office, what would you do? You can choose to just play Candy Crush on your phone all day. That's fine. Just like you can choose to let your roster sit this week without any moves. Or you could get a head start and start working on things that are happening next week. If you're trying to get a promotion, you'd probably do the latter. You'd probably work on things for next week. It's no different in fantasy football. You can plan ahead and you can gain an edge in doing so. This next question is from @M_Canella. It says, what is the cause for Philly's offensive fallout? Do you think they turn it around and finish strong? I think this is a really good example of recency bias and how it's so easy to allow recent performance to drive narratives. And this isn't just you here. We're all seeing people talk about Philly's offense. The Eagles have 2 offensive touchdowns over their last 2 games, so 1 per game. The week prior to that, week 12, they had 5. And from week 1 to week 12, they averaged 3.2 offensive touchdowns per game. What's something that's happened over the last 2 weeks that didn't necessarily happen during their first 11 games consistently? They faced 2 of the best defenses in football. They faced the 49ers and the Cowboys. I think if we were to come up with one reason and one reason only as to why the Eagles offense has struggled of late, it would be that. And during the fantasy playoffs, they get the Seahawks, Giants, and Cardinals. I would expect them to be much better over their next 3 games than they've been over their last 2. The last question this week is from Patreon, is from Eric. It says, for those of us looking ahead to week 16, thoughts on the top defenses? Would you rather have Buffalo or Denver? Thanks, no free agent budget, so need to make a pickup now. One of the things that's become very evident to me this year is how much time people spend thinking about defenses in the playoffs. And it's good to plan ahead. Don't get me wrong, you should be trying to stash defenses. But as an analyst, I just have to be honest when I say that I don't have some clear-cut answer at defense. There's a lot of variance. For me to sit here and say that you absolutely have to play this specific defense, not going to happen. Like Buffalo and Denver. Buffalo gets the Chargers. And again, I'm recording this before Thursday Night Football. But Buffalo gets the Chargers next week. The Broncos get the Patriots. On paper, I don't have this super strong feeling about either of those defenses. Like which one I would play versus the other. chances are they're going to be in the same tier for me. Now, as a tiebreaker, I would then look at week 17 and see what kind of matchup they had to see if I could just ride one defense through the end of the season. But funny enough, the Broncos and the Bills, they just flip their opponents. The Bills get the Pats, the Broncos get the Chargers. I guess I'd say Buffalo because they're likely going to be bigger favorites in those two games, but this is like a 55-45 thing, maybe a 51-49 thing. I'd be lying if I said I had very strong feelings about this. What's important, and this is the greater point here, what's important is that you're focused on the right consideration set. Both of those defenses are very, very good options from here on out. From week 16 on. So week 16 and week 17. And in week 16, you could look at maybe Green Bay against Carolina, the Chiefs against the Raiders if they're still out there, the Texans against the Browns in a deeper format, and the Jets against the Commanders. Overall, though, as long as you're looking at the right set of teams, which most people listening to this show, that's what you would do because you're very smart people, that's all I can ask for. There's too much variance in defense to definitively say you got to absolutely play this defense over the other when they're in the same tier, in that consideration set. It would be unfair for me to make you guys think otherwise. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribe to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I've got a Late Round Perspectives episode dropping later today, so I hope you listen to that. But otherwise, good luck in the first round of the playoffs. I'll talk to you next week.